Welcome to the Dread Journal. I am Ulrich Mossberg, and I shall be your guide through some of the most horrifying true stories sent to us. These stories are not urban legends, myths, or tall tales. They are true testimonials sent to us by those who have worked on oil rigs. These are tales sent by those who feel they must hide their identities, either due to the question of their sanities or hiding from corporate authorities, but still want to be heard. Oil rigs are some of the most desolate places on our planet. They are surrounded by deep, dark waters, and the terrors they hide are reflected in these stories. Now, let us look into some of these tales and see what will forever be added into the Dread Journal. My name is Danny, and I've been working on offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico for 15 years. In that time, I've seen equipment failure that could kill a man in seconds, storms that turn 100-ton platforms into toys, and accidents that haunt me to this day. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered on Deepwater Atlas during the summer of 2019. When I first started working offshore, the safety protocols were drilled into me harder than any bit ever drilled into bedrock. Every head count mattered. Every drill, every emergency alarm, every shift change. If one man was missing, the whole rig froze until he was found. Lives depended on it. The Gulf doesn't forgive mistakes, and a missing worker could mean someone was unconscious from gas exposure, fallen overboard, or trapped in machinery. In an environment where hydrogen sulfide can kill you in minutes and a single spark can turn the entire platform into a fireball, accounting for every soul isn't just policy, it's survival. I joined the crew of a rig as a maintenance technician in June. The rig was a massive, semi-submersible platform, housing 94 workers during peak operations. She was positioned about 180 miles southeast of New Orleans, drilling in waters so deep you couldn't see the bottom even on the clearest of days. The crew was a mix of seasoned roughnecks and college-educated engineers, but we all shared the same respect for the ocean's power and the rig's dangers. My supervisor was a weathered Texan named Carl, who had been working offshore since the early 80s. Carl ran a tight ship, every tool accounted for, every safety protocol followed to the letter. He'd seen too many good men die from carelessness to tolerate even minor infractions. During my first week, he pulled me aside after the evening head count. "Son," he said, tobacco juice staining from the corner of his mouth, "I've been doing this for 37 years, and I can count every man on this rig in my sleep, but lately something's been off with the numbers." I figured he was testing me somehow, seeing if I'd picked up on some safety issue I'd missed. "What kind of problem, sir?" Carl looked out at the dark water surrounding us, the rig's lights reflecting off the waves like fallen stars. "During evening roll call, I keep counting one more man than the roster shows. Just one. Not two, not five, always exactly one extra." At first, I thought it was fatigue. 12-hour shifts in the Gulf heat could mess with anyone's mind. The combination of physical exhaustion, irregular sleep activities, and the constant stress of working above thousands of feet of black water took its toll on even the most experienced hands. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing it too. During the 6 p.m. head count, Paul would gather us on the main deck, clipboard in hand, calling out the names alphabetically. Anderson, Boudreaux, Penn, Daniels, all the way through to Williams and Young. 94 names on the roster. But when Carl did his visual count, pointing at each man as he tallied, he always came up with 95. 93, 94, 95, he'd mutter, then recount. Same result. He'd check his clipboard, verify the roster, count again. The math never added up. Other supervisors started reporting the same discrepancy. During shift changes, emergency drills, and routine safety briefings, the head counts consistently showed one extra man, sometimes standing near the back of the group, coveralls stained with the same grime we all carried, hard hat pulled low over his face, always blending in perfectly with the rest of us. But when names were called, no one answered to that 95th person. First time I saw him clearly was during a fire routine drill in late July. The alarm had sounded at 2 a.m., standard procedure to test our response times when most of the crew was asleep. We stumbled out of our quarters in various states of dress, grabbing hard hats and life jackets, assembling at the designated muster point on the port side of the rig. As we lined up, I counted the familiar faces around me. Johnson from Louisiana, Martinez from Texas, O'Brien from Ireland, who never stopped talking about the weather back home. But there, at the edge of the group, where the rig's lights cast longer shadows, stood someone I didn't recognize. He wore the same orange coveralls we all did, the same white hard hat with reflective tape, the same steel-toed boots, but something was off about his posture. Too still, too rigid, like a doll positioned by someone who had never seen how real people stand. His face remained hidden behind the brim of his helmet, and when the ocean breeze that constantly swept the platform moved everyone else's coveralls, his remained perfectly still. I nudged at Martinez, who was standing next to me. "Hey, who's the new guy?" I pointed toward the figure, but when I looked back, he was gone. Not walked away, not moved to another position, simply absent, as if he had never been there at all. The drill concluded with Carl's usual count discrepancy. 94 names on the roster, 95 bodies accounted for. When he asked if anyone had seen the extra worker, a few hands went up tentatively. Descriptions varied. Some said he was tall, others average height. Some remembered dark coveralls, others swore they were the standard orange. The only consistent detail was that no one could recall his face. Management's response was predictable. Faulty logs, human error, optical illusions created by fatigue and artificial lighting. The rig's safety coordinator, a company man named Peterson, who'd never worked a day on an actual drilling platform, dismissed the reports with bureaucratic efficiency. He suggested we implement a buddy system for head counts and recommended additional rest periods to combat what he called shift-related stress hallucinations. But the experienced hands knew better, because the accident started right after that. At first, they were minor incidents that could be chalked up to normal offshore hazards. Tools went missing from secure storage, only to be found in dangerous locations. Like a wrench left on a catwalk where it could fall on someone below, or a gas detector placed near a high-pressure line where a leak might go undetected. Safety equipment appeared in the wrong configurations. Harnesses with subtle cuts in the webbing that wouldn't be noticed until they were under load, hard hats with cracked shells that would provide no protection in an impact. Then came the near misses. A valve was partially left open on a pressurized line, only discovered when a technician noticed unusual gauge readings during routine inspection. A safety rail on the upper deck was found loose, its bolts backed out just enough to give way under weight. Emergency lighting in a critical corridor failed during a night shift, leaving workers to navigate in darkness around dangerous machinery. The pattern became impossible to ignore when Jake, a driller from Alabama with 20 years of experience, took a fall from the drilling platform. Jake was legendary for his attention to detail and to safety. He was the kind of worker who double-checked every harness clip and never took shortcuts, no matter how routine the task. His equipment was inspected after the incident. Harness in perfect condition, safety line properly secured, all protocols followed exactly. But Jake swore that someone had brushed past him on the narrow catwalk just before he lost his balance. A firm shoulder contact that shifted his weight at the worst possible moment sent him over the rail. He managed to catch himself on a lower platform, suffering only bruised ribs and a dislocated shoulder that could have easily been a fatal plunge into the water. When we reviewed the security footage, the incident was clearly visible. Jack was walking along the catwalk, suddenly lurching sideways, grabbing for the rail as he fell. But the moment of contact he described was obscured by a strange blur in the recording, a distortion that made it impossible to see what, if anything, had caused him to stumble. The timestamp showed the exact moment when our evening head count had registered 95 workers instead of 94. I started keeping detailed records, documenting every discrepancy in a notebook I carried in my coveralls. Date, time, location, weather conditions, and descriptions from anyone who claimed to see the extra worker. The pattern that emerged was undeniable. Whenever the mysterious 95th man appeared during head counts, accidents followed within 24 hours. A gas leak in the pump room discovered just before it reached explosive concentration, a crane cable that snapped under load, sending a half-ton pipe section crashing into the deck inches from where two workers had been standing moments before. A fire in the galley that started when a seemingly functional stove suddenly began leaking propane, filling the enclosed space with invisible death until someone's cigarette lighter nearly turned the kitchen into a bomb. Each incident was preceded by sightings of the extra worker, always silent, always watching, never speaking or responding to direct contact. Workers started seeing him in peripheral vision, standing at the end of a corridor, observing from an upper platform, present in their workspace when they arrived, but gone when they turned for a second look. The most disturbing encounters happened during night shifts, when the rig's skeleton crew worked under harsh artificial lighting that created deep shadows between the illuminated areas. Workers reported feeling watched, sensing presence in empty spaces, hearing footsteps that didn't match their own movement patterns. The figure appeared most often during routine maintenance tasks, standing just outside of the range of work lights, observing activities with an attention that felt predatory rather than curious. There was a welder named Frank who had the most unsettling encounter. He was working alone in the lower equipment bay, replacing corroded fittings on a seawater intake line. The work required him to crawl into a confined space, barely large enough for his body and tools, with his legs protruding out into the main walkway. "I heard footsteps," Frank told me later, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by obvious fear. "Heavy boots on metal deck plating, getting closer. I called out, thinking maybe someone needed to get past, but no answer. The steps stopped right next to my legs." Frank tried to back out of the confined space to see who was there, but something was preventing his movement. Not physically holding him, but creating resistance like he was pushing against a strong current. I could feel something standing there, looking down at me, cold, like standing in front of an open freezer. But when I finally got loose and looked up, nothing. Nobody there. When Frank returned to complete his work the next day, he discovered that the fittings he'd been replacing had been cross-threaded during installation, a mistake that would have caused a high-pressure leak within hours of the system being pressurized. He swore the threads had been properly aligned when he'd stopped work, but the evidence suggested otherwise. After 3 months of these incidents, I decided to confront Carl directly. I found him in his office after the evening shift, reviewing maintenance logs by the light of a desk lamp. The rig's constant mechanical humming provided a background soundtrack that almost all of us had learned to ignore. But in the small, enclosed space, it felt oppressive. "Carl, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." He looked up from his paperwork, eyes red with fatigue. "Shoot." "Do you really believe that there's an extra man on this rig?" Carl leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just stared at the coffee stain on his desk blotter that had been there since I'd arrived. When he finally answered, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Danny, I've worked on 17 different rigs in my career. I've seen men die from accidents that should have never happened, and I've seen others walk away from situations that should have killed them. I've learned to trust my instincts about danger, even when I can't explain why something feels wrong." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with handwritten entries. "I started keeping track 3 years ago when this first started happening. Not just here. Other platforms, other crews, the pattern's always the same. Extra worker appears in head counts, accidents increase. Sometimes it's a minor incident, sometimes people die." "What do you think it is?" I asked him. Carl shrugged, closing the notebook. "Hell, I don't know. Ghost of someone who died out here? Some kind of warning system the ocean created? Could be we're all losing our minds from too much time breathing recycled air. All I know for certain is this. When the numbers don't add up, people get hurt. And the worker we can't identify is somehow connected to it." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I'm going to give you the same advice I've given the other supervisors. Don't follow him. Don't try to confront him. Don't investigate. When you see something that doesn't make sense, walk away. Document it if you want, but keep your distance." "Why?" I asked. "Because the one time I tried to get in a close look, 3 men nearly died in the explosion that happened the next day. The most significant event occurred on a Thursday night in early September. I was working the late shift, conducting routine inspections of the emergency shutdown systems that could stop drilling operations in case of a dangerous pressure buildup. The work took me to the lower levels of the rig, where the constant noise of pumps and generators created an industrial symphony that masked other sounds. Around 2 a.m., the gas detection alarms began sounding, a piercing electronic wail that potentially meant lethal concentrations of hydrogen sulfide had been detected somewhere on the platform. Within seconds, the general alarm joined in, creating a cacophony that could be heard for miles across the dark gulf. Emergency protocols kicked in automatically, ventilation systems activated to clear potentially contaminated air, non-essential electrical systems shut down to prevent ignition sources, and the crew began evacuation procedures to move everyone to safe areas upwind of any leaks. I was making my way towards the muster point when I saw him. The extra worker was standing at the far end of Corridor C, motionless in the flashing red emergency lights that bathed everything in this dark illumination. Same coveralls, same helmet, face hidden in shadow as always. But this time, instead of observing from a distance, he was positioned directly in my evacuation route. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached, gas detector in one hand, emergency radio in another. Emergency procedure called for everyone to evacuate immediately, but something about his presence felt important, like he was trying to communicate something critical. "Hey!" I shouted over the alarm noise. "You need to get to the muster point! This isn't a drill!" He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Instead, he turned slowly, like a mechanical device operating on failing batteries, and walked towards the sealed maintenance hatch at the end of the corridor. I followed, though every instinct and Carl's advice had told me to head to safety. The hatch led to a confined space that had been welded shut years earlier after being deemed unnecessary for the operations on the rig. The welds were solid, the metal painted over multiple times. There was no way to open it without cutting equipment. The figure stopped in front of the hatch and simply stood there, as if waiting for something. I approached cautiously, my gas detector clicking more rapidly as I drew near, indicating increasing concentration of dangerous gases. When I was close enough to touch him, he directly looked at me. I still can't adequately describe what I saw. It wasn't a face, more like the suggestion of facial features glimpsed through heavy fog. Eyes that reflected like an animal's, but with no color or depth. A mouth that might have been speaking, but produced no sound. Features that shifted when I tried to focus on them, as if looking at something underwater. He raised one arm, covered in coveralls identical to mine, and pointed at the sealed hatch. He then stepped forward and disappeared directly through the solid metal, like walking through an open doorway. I stood frozen for several seconds, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The gas detector in my hand was clicking rapidly now, its needle approaching the red zone that indicated immediately dangerous concentrations. Whatever was behind the hatch was the source of the leak. Training took over. I radioed the emergency coordinator, reporting the location of the gas source and requesting immediate attention from the hazmat team. A few minutes later, workers arrived with cutting torches and forced entry tools, opening the sealed space I'd seen the figure go into. Gas hissed out from under pressure, a mix of hydrogen sulfide with methane that could have killed anyone in the confined space within minutes. If the concentration had continued building, the entire lower level would have become uninhabitable, forcing evacuation of the rig and potentially causing a catastrophic release when the gas found an ignition source. The source was a corroded fitting on an abandoned service line that should have been completely isolated. Somehow, pressure had built up in the supposedly empty system, creating a leak where no one would normally look until it was too late. After the emergency was contained, I reviewed the security footage from the corridor. The camera showed me walking down the hallway, stopping in front of the sealed hatch, and radioing for help. But they didn't show anyone else. Not the figure I followed, not the person who had led me to discover the gas leak. The timestamp confirmed that 95 workers had been counted during the previous shift change, but the man I'd encountered wasn't visible on any recording. The official incident report credited me with discovering the leak during routine inspection. My supervisors commended my vigilance and attention to safety protocols. But I knew the truth. Without the extra workers' intervention, that gas buildup could have killed dozens of people when it eventually found an ignition source. I left the rig 2 weeks later, transferring to a platform closer to shore where the head counts always matched the roster exactly. But the extra workers' story didn't end with my departure. Through the network of offshore workers who move between rigs throughout the Gulf, I've continued hearing similar reports. A figure in coveralls who appears during head counts but isn't on any personnel list. Accidents that follow sightings of unexplained workers. Incidents prevented by mysterious interventions that can't be documented or explained. Sometimes, the encounters end tragically. A crew in the Permian Basin reported seeing an extra worker for weeks before a blowout killed 11 men. Workers on a platform off Louisiana described similar sightings before a helicopter crash that claimed 4 lives. The pattern suggests that while the figure sometimes warns of danger, he can't always prevent the disasters he predicts. Other times, like my experience with the gas leak, the encounters serve as warnings that save lives. Workers have reported being led away from dangerous areas just before accidents, finding safety in unexpected places during emergencies, and discovering hazards that would have gone undetected until they became fatal. To this day, I don't know if he's a ghost, a guardian spirit, or something the ocean itself created to watch over the lives of thousands of workers who still risk everything to extract resources beneath the waves. All I know for certain is that the extra worker still appears on rigs throughout the Gulf and beyond, showing up in head counts where his presence defies explanation. Different platforms, different crews, same story. Always one more man than the roster indicates. And whenever he appears, the mathematics of survival become more complicated than simple addition and subtraction. So if you ever find yourself working offshore and the head count doesn't match the personnel list, pay attention. Don't dismiss it as fatigue or counting errors, because sometimes the person who isn't supposed to be there is the only thing standing between you and disaster. And if you see him, really see him, standing in the shadows where the lights don't reach, listen to what he's trying to tell you. He may not speak, but his message is always the same. Somewhere on the platform, death is preparing to collect its due. Some workers never clock out. They just keep working, shift after shift, trying to prevent the accidents they couldn't avoid in life. The extra worker is one of them, and his presence in your head count might mean that someone might not make it home. If you're enjoying this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you get all of our latest videos. And if you have stories that you want to share with us, please send them to me, Ulrich Mossberg, at thedreadjournal@gmail.com. My name is Marcus, and I've been a mechanical systems engineer for 12 years, specializing in offshore climate control and environmental systems. I've worked platforms from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arabian Sea, but nothing in my education or experience prepared me for what I encountered in the North Sea during the winter of 2021. When engineers design offshore platforms, heating and cooling systems are standardized down to the smallest detail. Every section, every cabin, every corridor maintains the same temperature within a narrow range, typically between 68 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The systems are redundant, monitored continuously, and designed to function in the harshest marine environments imaginable. Temperature control isn't just about comfort, it's about survival. In the North Sea, where winter storms can drop air temperatures to -20 and winds can reach hurricane force, a failed heating system means death within hours. But what happens when the instruments show readings that no reservoir could ever produce, readings from wells that were never meant to be drilled? I joined the crew of this oil rig in November, brought in to upgrade the platform's aging HVAC systems during a scheduled maintenance period. The rig was a massive semi-submersible platform positioned 150 miles northeast of Aberdeen, extracting natural gas from deposits beneath the seabed. It housed 127 workers, so the platform was essentially a small city floating in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. The crew chief who briefed me was a Scottish engineer named Ian McLeod, a veteran of North Sea operations who'd worked offshore for over 20 years. During my first week, he walked me through the platform's climate control infrastructure, a complex network of heating units, ventilation ducts, and temperature sensors that maintained livable conditions throughout the massive structure. The North Sea doesn't forgive mistakes, Ian told me as we inspected the central control room where all environmental systems were monitored. Temperature regulation fails out here, and people die. That's why we over-engineer everything, maintain multiple backups, and check the systems twice daily. The control room was impressive. Banks of monitors displaying real-time temperature readings from every section of the platform, automatic alerts for any deviation from normal parameters, and backup controls that could override any malfunctioning unit. Everything was color coded, clearly labeled, and designed for immediate response to any environmental emergency. But a month into my contract, strange complaints started filtering through the maintenance requests. It began with cabin 14B, two-person quarters on the lower residential deck. Tommy, a driller from Liverpool, reported that his cabin was freezing cold despite the thermostat showing normal temperature. He and his roommate, a Norwegian roughneck named Eric, swore that they could see their breath inside the cabin even when the heating system indicated it was maintaining the standard 70-degree temperature. When I investigated personally, the situation was exactly as it was described. The air in cabin 14B was cold enough to fog my breath, probably around 45 degrees Fahrenheit based on my experience, but every system check came back normal. The thermostat read 70 degrees. The heating unit was functioning properly, blowing warm air through the vents. The insulation showed no signs of damage on air leaks. According to every instrument I had, the cabin should have at least been perfectly comfortable. I ran diagnostics on the heating unit, checked the ductwork, tested the thermostat calibration, and even brought in thermal imaging equipment to look over heat loss through the walls. Everything functioned exactly as designed. The heating system was delivering the correct amount of warm air, the cabin was properly insulated, and there were no obvious sources of heat loss. Yet the actual temperature remained uncomfortably cold. Just two corridors over, I encountered the opposite problem. Cabin 16A was reported as unbearably hot, while the occupants, two welders from Texas named Roberts and Martinez, complaining that they were sweating through their uniforms despite keeping the thermostat at its lowest setting. When I entered their cabin, the heat hit me like I was opening an oven door. The air was stifling, probably in the mid-80s, making it difficult to breathe comfortably. Again, all the systems checked out perfectly. The cooling system was operating normally, circulating air at the correct temperature and volume. The thermostat showed 70 degrees. There were no obvious heat sources, no faulty electrical equipment, no solar heating through windows, no problems with the ventilation system. Yet the actual temperature was high enough to cause heat exhaustion. Within weeks, more reports came in from throughout the platform. Workers described encountering pockets of extreme temperature that defied every logical explanation. Sections of the corridors where the air temperature dropped so suddenly that condensation formed on exposed metal surfaces. Stairwells where the handrails became too hot to touch safely, requiring workers to use gloves when climbing between decks. The pattern was both random and consistent. Random in the affected areas that seemed to have no relationship to the platform's mechanical systems, but consistent in that the same locations repeatedly showed temperature anomalies despite all equipment functioning normally. I documented every complaint, ran comprehensive diagnostics on all affected areas, and even brought in specialists from the platform's engineering contractor to examine the systems. Every test, every measurement, every analysis showed identical equipment performing identically throughout the platform. There were no mechanical failures, no design flaws, no installation errors that could account for the temperature variations. That's when I started researching the platform's history, hoping to find some explanation in the construction, in its records, or in its previous maintenance logs. What I discovered changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. So this rig had been constructed in 2019, but it wasn't the first platform to operate in this exact location. The original platform had operated here from 1987 to 2001 before being decommissioned due to structural fatigue and replaced with newer technology. Before this one, there had been two earlier platforms dating back to the 1970s, lost to accidents that claimed multiple lives. I cross-referenced the temperature anomaly locations with historical records from the previous platforms, using archived blueprints and incident reports that I requested from the Norwegian Petroleum Authority and the UK Health and Safety Executive. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Cabin 14B corresponded exactly to the location where a maintenance worker named Thomas had died during a blizzard evacuation from the original 1970s platform. Thomas had been trapped in his quarters when the evacuation helicopter couldn't return due to storm conditions. He was found 3 days later, frozen to death when the platform's heating system failed during the emergency. Cabin 16A matched the positions where a galley fire on the previous platform had killed 2 workers in 1994. The fire had started in the kitchen's deep fryer and spread rapidly throughout the dining area, trapping the men in a room that became a furnace before emergency teams could reach them. Every anomalous zone aligned with locations where fatal accidents had occurred on the previous platforms. A stairwell that now became unbearably hot corresponded to where an electrical fire had killed an engineer back in '83. A corridor section that dropped to near freezing temperatures matched the site where 3 workers had died of hypothermia during a platform evacuation back in '91. Different platforms, different decades, but somehow the locations of past tragedies were manifesting environmental anomalies on the current structure. It was as if the coordinates themselves retained some memory of the deaths that had occurred there, translating historical trauma into present-day physical phenomena. I ran thermal imaging scans during the night shifts when fewer people were moving around the platform, hoping to get cleaner readings of the temperature variations. The results were both scientifically fascinating and deeply unsettling. The thermal cameras picked up distinct hot and cold temperatures in the anomalous zones, but not random temperature variations. Instead, they showed clearly defined human-shaped thermal patterns. In the cold zones, the cameras detected warm silhouettes, roughly person-sized and shaped, standing motionless in corridors and leaning against door frames. In the hot zones, the opposite appeared. Cold human-shaped shadows surrounded by areas of intense heat. The thermal signatures weren't moving randomly or shifting like normal heat patterns would. They maintained consistent human postures, standing upright, arms at their sides, heads turned as if looking down corridors or into rooms. Some appeared to be sitting, others walking in slow, regular patterns that suggested purposeful movements rather than random thermal fluctuations. During one late-night inspection, I discovered something even more disturbing. The thermal signatures appeared to be aware of my presence. As I moved through the affected areas with my handheld thermal camera, the heat patterns would shift orientation, as if turning to watch me pass. When I stopped to take detailed readings, additional signatures would appear, clustering around my position like an invisible crowd gathering to observe. The crew began avoiding the affected areas whenever possible. Workers requested transfers to different cabins, maintenance teams refused assignments in the anomalous zones, and the night shift reported feeling constantly watched in the corridors where thermal anomalies were the strongest. Several workers complained of physical sensations, feeling cold hands touch them in the hot zones, experiencing sudden temperature changes that left them disoriented and nauseous. James, an electrician from Glasgow, had the most disturbing encounter. He was working alone in a maintenance room that corresponded to where a worker had died in a hydrogen sulfide leak during the '80s. The room had been showing extreme cold readings for weeks, with ice forming on the interior walls despite the heating system running constantly. I was replacing a circuit breaker when I felt someone standing behind me, James reported. Cold, like someone had opened a freezer door right behind my back. I turned around and there was nobody there, but I could see my breath suddenly, like the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in a second. James finished his work as quickly as possible, but as he was leaving, he felt what he described as a freezing hand grip his arm just above the elbow. The sensation was so intense that it left a mark, a handprint-shaped area of frostbite that required medical treatment. The incident occurred in a room where the instruments showed the temperature was a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit. I filed comprehensive reports with platform management, documenting the temperature anomalies, the correlation with historical accidents, and the thermal imaging evidence. The response was predictable corporate dismissal. Crew hysteria caused by prolonged offshore duty. Environmental stress reactions. Instruments calibration errors due to extreme weather conditions. But the incidents continued escalating. Workers began reporting physical symptoms that couldn't be explained by normal environmental factors. Heat exhaustion in areas that measured cool, frostbite in areas that instruments showed as warm, respiratory problems that correlated with the thermal anomaly zones regardless of actual air quality measurements. Platform's medical officer, Dr. Sarah, documented cases that defied medical explanation. Workers arriving in the infirmary with symptoms of hypothermia despite having worked in areas where the environmental systems showed normal heating. Others with heat stroke and dehydration after working in sections that registered as properly air conditioned. I've treated environmental exposure for 15 years, Dr. Sarah told me during a private conversation. These symptoms are real, not psychological, but they don't match the environmental condition these workers were exposed to, according to our instruments. It's like their bodies were reacting to temperatures that don't exist on our monitoring systems. The breaking point came during a severe North Sea storm in early February. Winds reached 80 miles per hour, with waves tall enough to wash over the lower decks. The platform systems were stressed to their limits, with power fluctuations causing multiple equipment failures throughout the structure. I was conducting emergency inspections of critical systems when alarms began blaring from the lower maintenance level. The environmental control room was showing multiple temperature alerts from an area that had been previously stable, a corridor section that led me to the platform's emergency generator room. When I reached the affected area, the conditions were unlike anything I had encountered. The air was so cold it felt like walking into a deep freezer. My breath formed thick clouds of condensation that lingered in the still air. Frost was actively forming on the walls, spreading across the metal surfaces like living ice. The temperature was impossible. According to my handheld instruments, the temperature was below freezing, probably around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. But the corridor's heating system was running at full capacity, and the central environmental controls showed normal temperature readings. The physical evidence contradicted every measurement. As I moved deeper into the corridor, documenting the impossible conditions with my thermal camera, that's where I saw him. A man in coveralls stood at the far end of the hallway, motionless in the dim emergency lighting. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with a blue tinge that suggested severe hypothermia. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring straight ahead without blinking. Frost covered his hair and clothing. When he exhaled, no breath was visible, despite the sub-freezing air. I called out, asking if he needed assistance, but received no response. As I approached, the cold intensified until it felt like knives cutting through my insulated coveralls. The man remained perfectly still, watching me with those vacant, ice-glazed eyes. When I was close enough to touch him, he raised one frost-covered hand and whispered in a voice like the wind, with frozen rigging. The lights surged and flickered. Suddenly, intense heat slammed through the corridor like the blast from a furnace. The frost on the walls began melting instantly, causing steam that filled the air with scalding vapor. The metal surfaces became too hot to touch safely, and the air temperature spiked from below freezing to over 100 degrees within seconds. I stumbled backwards, half frozen from the initial cold and then burning from the sudden heat. My thermal camera was recording wildly fluctuating readings as the corridor shifted between extremes. The alarms were screaming, emergency lights were strobing, and the environmental systems were struggling to compensate for conditions that shouldn't have been possible. I made it to the stairwell and collapsed, my body trying to process the physiological shock of the rapid temperature changes. When I looked back down the corridor, everything appeared normal. The emergency lighting was steady, the air temperature felt comfortable, and the environmental monitoring systems showed no anomalies. But my thermal camera told a different story. The recorded data showed dozens of human-shaped thermal signatures filling the corridor during my encounter. Hot figures standing in the initial cold zone, cold silhouettes surrounded by the burning heat that followed, all of them facing toward my position, as if watching my reaction to their presence. Thermal patterns weren't random or equipment related. They showed clear human forms in various states of distress, some standing upright as if frozen in place, others crouched or collapsed as if overcome by heat. The shapes suggested people in work clothes, with some having their arms raised, as if trying to shield themselves from environmental extremes. I left the rig when my contract ended 2 weeks later. The platform management had dismissed my reports as stress-related hallucinations, and continuing to work in an environment where my professional observations were considered symptoms of mental breakdown seemed pointless. My replacement was briefed only on the standard environmental systems, with no mention of the temperature anomalies or the correlations with historical accidents. Through contacts in the offshore industry, I've continued hearing reports from that rig and other North Sea platforms. Workers describe encountering inexplicable temperature variations that defy all mechanical explanation, environmental zones that shift between burning heat and bitter cold without any relationship to the climate control systems. Thermal imaging equipment detects human-shaped signatures in areas where no living person is present. The pattern extends beyond individual platforms to entire regions of offshore operations, areas of the North Sea where multiple platforms have operated for over decades now show higher incidence of environmental anomalies. Coordinates where serious accidents have occurred seem to retain some form of thermal memory, creating conditions that reflect the circumstances of past tragedies. Marine engineers working in the Gulf of Mexico report similar phenomena around platforms where blowouts or fires have killed workers. Rigs in the Arabian Sea document temperature zones that correlate with historical accident sites. The coordinates themselves seem to remember, translating past trauma into present-day environmental anomalies that affect current operations. I've developed a theory based on my operations and observations and research into reports from other locations. Offshore platforms don't just sit on the ocean. They absorb the experiences that occur within their structures. Every accident, every tragedy, every death leaves some form of imprint that persists even when the original platform is replaced. The environmental systems we designed to maintain life may also be maintaining something else. The thermal signatures of past trauma, the physical memory of deaths that occurred in those specific coordinates. The heating and cooling equipment that keeps current workers alive might also be preserving the final moments of those who died in previous operations. Maybe the dead don't rest easy when steel platforms are rebuilt over the coordinates where they died. Maybe their final experiences, the heat of burning fires, the bitter cold of emergency evacuations, continue to manifest through the very systems designed to prevent those tragedies. I still dream about the zones, walking through corridors that shift from burning to freezing in heartbeats, feeling the presence of workers who died decades before I was born, their final moments replaying through environmental systems that can't forget what happened in those exact locations. The thermal imaging equipment I carried that night recorded more than temperature variations. It documented the persistence of human suffering in coordinates where death occurred, translated into environmental conditions that current instruments can measure but can't explain. That platform continues operating in the North Sea, extracting resources from beneath some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. New workers arrive, experience the temperature anomalies, file reports that are dismissed as equipment malfunctions or stress reactions, and eventually accept that some aspects of offshore work can't be explained through conventional engineering. The environmental systems continue maintaining life for living while preserving the thermal memory of the dead. And in the coordinates where past tragedies occurred, the temperature zones persist, hot and cold signatures of human suffering that no amount of mechanical precision can regulate or control. Some experiences burn too deep to be forgotten. Some cold cuts too sharp to ever be warmed. And some platforms remember everything that ever happened within their steel boundaries, maintaining those memories through the heating and cooling systems that keep their current occupants alive. If you ever find yourself working offshore and the environmental readings don't match what your body is telling you, then trust your physical sensations over the instruments, because sometimes the most sophisticated climate control systems are maintaining more than comfortable working conditions. They're maintaining the final moments of everyone who ever died in those exact coordinates, preserved in the steel and circuitry and thermal memory that never fades.